just very quickly, Vic Adamowicz and crew, they really have been very interested in the general issue about putting some sort of economic analysis to threatened species conservation. That doing, even though Sarah pushes you strongly that you've got to protect things that are all endangered in that, it obviously has very huge economic implications, and we need to explore those to see how we might deal with them in some ways. And so this is the question Vic and team have put together, and there are a number of ways you can look at it. You need to define conservation objectives. How do you achieve those objectives at the least cost? And then you need to understand what the trade-offs are as a society to try and make more informed decisions. And again, this comes at it from not from the typical ecological, natural sciences point of view, but from more from a socioeconomic argument. And you can see the people involved in the work here and the collaborators that have been involved also. So what these guys have been up to primarily is producing that map I showed you, which is the net present value map. Looks like a nice, easy, simple, trivial GIS layer. Hugely complicated, complex thing to produce, and this is where these guys excel. And I think they produced one of the best assessments of that you'll see in the literature anywhere. Then you combine that with a series of models that basically look at how things change over time as you exploit the resource and make conservation decisions, and then how that feeds back on caribou. Pretty straightforward, and that's the work that Rick Schneider did as well that I showed you in previously. In many ways, it's just producing this curve. What's the trade-off between the cost, which is the cost of actually doing conservation, versus the benefit, which is ever-increasing number of caribou protected? We have to build that curve, and these people have devoted a lot of time to that. So the caribou axis, we've come up with a variety of things. I don't want to go into detail. One can wrangle over how you would best do this. They've done a couple of them. And then in terms of the cost axis, as I say again, they really tried to wrestle this down to the ground, and as usual, I think it's outstanding. If you put it to an economist, they think it's a piece of crap because it's not detailed and you haven't worried about X, Y, and Z. But to me, it's caught the level we need to try and go forward to make some decisions. The model is this integration of economics and ecology, and it's got a number of constraints in it, and it basically leads to outputs like this. So here is a curve showing you the number of herds that we have, and there are roughly 14 herds in the province, and what would it cost us if we wanted to make all of those 14 herds self-sustaining. And the most interesting part, which is not surprising, is this curve is not linear. In fact, you can gain a lot for relatively little cost over a lot of range of the caribou herds. Then the costs go way, way up. And that's because of this differential resource under the ground, depending on what herds you deal with, basically. But Vic has also looked at something really interesting, because the pushback we got on all our models is to say, geez, you know, you're not taking into account the value of those damn caribou. There's value in them. The question is, how do you capture that value? You know, they're not worth nothing. They're not worth anything in terms of trying to sell them. You know, how do you put a dollar value to them? So what Vic did is twist this around in a really creative way. Instead, they said, instead of what's the value, is what's your willingness to pay for having them around, which is a measure of value. So that's what this WTP is. So basically, they've gone to the public and says, if we had to increase the number of taxes you pay to protect these caribou, how much more money would you be willing to pay to have them protected? And this has been an exercise in terms of polling the public to try and get their response, putting this information to them in a trade-off type of way and seeing what their willingness to pay is. And I think it's really very interesting, and it's starting to give us a feeling for how much people in fact value caribou. how much they're willing to give up in terms of what it means to their pocketbook, and how much they're willing to drop off in terms of caribou to maintain their standard of living. So they put a number of options to people in as informed a way as possible. They gave them preliminary information, and then they got people to make decisions about trade-offs. And really they equated that into what the household share of the income tax would be or needed to be increased over the next 50 years to compensate for this caribou protection. And this is based on calculations that they've done. And so it's not huge dollars, but this is what it comes down to. This is what was put to the people. If you want to keep 6 herds out there, folks, it's going to cost you another $75 a year in terms of income tax. So most people can identify with that. And if they think about it seriously, then it's clearly created a trade-off situation. And then they can produce these curves and make some sort of evaluation of the actual value of caribou. And some quick lessons learned from, it's really neat. We hate this damn trade-off issue. We're more than happy to say, I'll protect every caribou in the world if it doesn't cost me anything. But put a trade-off on there and all of a sudden, it's not so great. And you come away kind of feeling a bit unclean when you made your decision, because it's not perfect by any means, right? But the conservation objectives are extremely challenging to define, but until you quantify those, you can't go too far. And this is a lot of work that Vic and crew have, I think, excelled in to try and make these much more explicit. And making these objectives clear really formalizes this ability then to pursue this trade-off in a much more rigorous way, rather than an airy-fairy word, the typical government 3-pillar story, right, which has no quantity behind it, just these words. This is much more explicit. You can't get away without trading off. That's the fundamental issue. And these things, by these sorts of polling, you can actually get a feeling for what the public preference is for these conservation issues. And that, in the end, is what's going to drive where we land in terms of the overall conservation. So I think quite important work as a consequence of that. I think, and this is ongoing. They continue to work at this, and probably, I think, have clear intentions of applying this to more than just caribou, this type of approach.